And so there are self-respecting reasons, Kant thinks, to sort of push us out into the world and to use our capacities and to engage those capacities well, to learn things, to educate ourselves, to participate in the lives of a community, which it doesn't get as much focus as like the objection to lying does, but is a really important part of Kant's ethics, because Kant thinks that part of our task as moral beings is to help further the progress of humanity.
All right, so welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Karen Stohr. She is a Ryan Family Chair Professor of Metaphysics and Moral Philosophy at Georgetown University, where she's also a senior research scholar in the Canadian Institute of Ethics. Her work focuses primarily on ethics, and her books include On Manners, Minding the Gap, Moral Ideas and Moral Improvement, and Choosing Freedom, Kantian Guide to Life, which will be our focus for today. She also has various articles on these and related topics. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Stohr.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Yeah. So as I said in the introduction, we're going to focus on your book from 2022, I believe, called Choosing Freedom, A Kantian Guide to Life. To begin, can you just give a bit of an overview of this book? Like, who is this book for, and maybe what can people hope to get out of it?
Yeah, so this book is part of a series that Oxford University Press put out. It started a few years ago on guides to the good life. And there are several different books in it so far and more coming out. And each of them focuses on a particular figure and aims to sort of orient a reader toward that philosopher and that philosopher's sort of thought, but in the frame of philosophy as a way of life or a way of living or a guide to life. So it's very practically oriented. And the series is also aimed at general readers, not just other academics, although I've read the other books in the series and learned quite a lot of things that I didn't know before. Each of them is written by someone who already writes a lot on that topic, but the books themselves are aimed at helping a reader understand how the thinker or tradition in question thought about how one should undertake sort of ordinary life activities. And so Kant isn't an obvious choice in this series, because it's usually people think about Stoicism or Buddhism or existentialism or something else, not generally Kant. So it was a bit of a challenge to sort of reorient my thinking about Kant this way. But it also corresponds to how I teach Kant anyway. So it was kind of an interesting challenge that way. It was thinking, what is it that I want students to know when I'm teaching? What is it that I want them to take away? And then trying to turn that into something like a book that would focus on the aspects of Kant's practical philosophy that help us think through how we make choices, or what kinds of character traits we develop, or what kinds of virtues or vices are out there, and how we should sort of think about our day-to-day interactions with other people and the world more generally. So it did require a kind of reorientation in my thinking, but the book itself I'm really happy with as a whole, and I think the series is a real plus to the discipline of philosophy and to readers more generally.
Yeah, for sure. It's sort of, and it's also difficult just getting a grasp on a lot of Kant's ideas, especially since, I don't know, he's not the most easy writer, person to understand. So I don't know, how is that something that you, how difficult did you find it, sort of going through it and trying to communicate his ideas in a accessible way?
Yeah, so there's a picture that I think a lot of people have that's primarily based on the groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, which usually if people have read one of Kant's ethical texts or part of one, it's that one. And there's good reasons for that, because of course it's really philosophically important, but it's not a super accessible text. And if you're thinking about Kant as a kind of Kantianism as a sort of normative theory that's aimed at giving us sort of ways of thinking about our ordinary life, it's also in some ways not ideal, because in that book, Kant is deliberately abstracting away from the conditions of human life and the sort of the material sort of the ways in which we are embodied rational agents. But he has a lot to say about that in other works and later works, in the Metaphysics of Morals, and then also in the Anthropology and the Lectures of Ethics on Ethics and the Religion. So I think that one of the goals of this book is to both try to make Kant accessible, to see that, to tell people like, look, actually, yes, he was really, really hard to read, but he has some really, really interesting, influential, and I think profoundly powerful ideas. And then try to sort of help people see what those ideas are and how they fit into this more abstract framework. So in the introduction to the book, I talk about the sort of the challenge for kind of seeing the forest through the trees, because the trees, like trying to understand what Kant is saying on any given page of his text is very difficult. And it can make it really hard to sort of lose sight of his bigger picture. So I also want people to kind of focus on sort of the big picture, but also on some of the smaller things that Kant says that help illuminate that bigger picture. So it's a kind of moving back and forth between the very abstract stuff that Kant says and the big sort of ethical theory that he's trying to put forward, and some of the more specific claims that he makes about terrain that's really familiar, like friendship. He has a lot of really interesting things to say about friendship, or about drunkenness. There's a chapter in the book on drunkenness, because I think that's a really fun topic. Lots of stuff to say about self-respect. And these are topics that people can readily recognize as being important ethical things, but they don't realize that Kant had anything to say about them, or they don't know how they would use Kant to think about those things. And so the book is trying to sort of maybe bridge a sort of divide between the really, really abstract, obscure parts of Kant's moral philosophy that people tend to read, and the very sort of day-to-day concerns that drive much of our ethical life. And so the book kind of aims to say that Kant actually had things to say about lots of these things, and that his theory gives us really interesting ways to talk about those more specific practical issues.
Yeah, good. It's sort of interesting how in the book you explore some, well, more everyday things, like, that Kant either talks about directly, or whose stuff might be relevant to, like dinner parties and just engaging with friends and whatever. The
dinner party is one of my favorites.
Yeah. So before getting into Kant's moral philosophy more specifically, maybe we should talk a bit about some of the related views that he has that are certainly relevant to his moral philosophy, like freedom and human nature and rationality and such. To start, you mind just talking a bit about how Kant thinks about freedom and why it's important to his moral system?
Yeah, so we could spend a long time talking about Kant on freedom, but here's a short, it's certainly not perfect, partly because what Kant says about freedom also isn't consistent across all of his works, so that's also challenging. But there's sort of two kinds of freedom, basically, in Kant. There's negative freedom, which is essentially freedom from coercion, or freedom from being sort of determined. There's different ways of characterizing it, but being free from a kind of constraint. And then there's a positive freedom, which is, for Kant, attached to the exercise of rationality. So I am negatively free whenever I am acting in ways that are a result of things that I will, in some sense, or things that we might say, choose in my own, or for my own reasons. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm making a decision that Kant would regard as positively free. So, for instance, I might make a decision that I'm going to sit around all weekend and binge watch Netflix or play really, really stupid games. And that might sometimes be a good thing to do, but not if I have like grading to do or other kinds of things that I'm supposed to be doing. So I might be negatively free in the sense that no one is making me binge watch Netflix, but I'm not positively free in the sense that I might be making what are not great choices, and not great choices by my own lights, not by somebody else's lights, not because somebody else is looking at me being like, I can't believe you're spending all weekend binge watching Netflix. But if I've set myself goals of doing other kinds of things, like, I don't know, cleaning the basement or hanging out with friends or whatever it is, if I've set myself those goals, but I don't do them, and instead I just binge watch Netflix, then I'm not even acting in accordance with my own choices. And so for Kant to be positively free in the positive sense, which is the sense that is most significant for morality, I need to be acting in accordance with my own ideas, my own sort of rational will. So we might distinguish between like freedom as kind of a license, like just being able to do whatever you want, and freedom as a kind of constrained way of making choices that actually comport with your own status as a rational being.
Right. Yeah, and we'll probably get into that more. But when you think about acting in ways that comport with your own status as a rational being. So the alternative would be acting in irrational ways, or letting other things sort of intervene in how you act, or how would you characterize that?
Yeah, so it could be acting in ways that are not reflective of my own choices. So if I'm just sort of doing whatever somebody else tells me to do, for Kant, that would often, not always, but often be a problem. But for his main focus is actually on ways in which we sort of get in our own way, acting on our inclinations, or inclinations that can become something more sinister, like passions or vices. And so for Kant, the challenge of morality is often overcoming our own desires. So back to the example of like sitting on the couch, we've probably all had this experience of, sitting there doing something like, I don't know, playing some dumb game when we really should go to bed because we have a busy day the next day and we really need more sleep than that. And so we just know that it's going to be, we're just, setting ourselves up for a problem the next day. And yet we still sit there on the couch playing the game or whatever, not going to bed or not going to sleep when we think we should. So this is an incredibly human way to behave. We're all familiar with it. All kinds of sort of irrationality. And these are the sorts of situations that Kant thinks we find ourselves in frequently, where there's a sense in which I have to sort of get hold of myself. And myself here, I don't mean in some like kind of weird, like there's some like inner self. But when I tell myself, like I really need to like get off the couch and go to bed or go make dinner or whatever it is that I'm not doing, that sort of inner monologue, we might say, is kind of an inner monologue between the sort of the part of me that wants to stay on the couch and not do the thing, and the part of me that's like, I really need to go do this. And so even though Kant wouldn't characterize it as kind of like a mini argument, we often experience it that way phenomenologically. And so for Kant, that the inclination, right, the tendency to be like, oh, I want to stay on the couch. Like, I don't want to do this other thing. It's a lot of work to go upstairs or make dinner or whatever. Those inclinations to sit on the couch are the things that we kind of have to fight in ourselves. And how much we have to fight them really sort of depends on how hard it is to do what's the pull of sitting on the couch. And so this is just like one example of what Kant thinks is a really common pattern in our lives, that what we're trying to do is develop a sort of a form of reasoning that is going to be efficacious in getting us to do the things that reason is directing us to do. And in doing that, what we're often doing is fighting aspects of ourselves that make that difficult.
Right. Yeah, and we'll definitely get into some of that with the vices and so on. Yeah, and then regarding human nature, as we already started talking about. Yeah, so Kant thinks that, on one hand, we have great potential and we can act according to reason, live rationally and freely, and so on. But on the other hand, we can exhibit various vices and act in other ways and such. Can you talk about Kant's thinking here about human nature, and maybe including how he thinks about like radical evil and how we can become a good person?
Yeah, so for Kant, of course, in the groundwork, the focus is on us as rational wills. But Kant, of course, knows that we're not just like pure rational wills, that instead we're embodied. And the embodied version of us, which is the ones we have, are tied to lots of sort of features of human nature that Kant thinks were sort of takes it to be a given. So Kant grew up and was shaped by a form of Lutheranism known as Pietism, which was a fairly austere type of Protestantism. And so Kant has kind of, I don't know, maybe a love-hate relationship with Pietism is not the right description, but there's some aspects of it that he very clearly rejected. But other aspects of it that I think also pretty clearly shaped some of how he thinks about human nature. So he thinks of us as, to say that he thinks of us as like fallen or corrupted is probably too strong, but he does think that we have both we have sort of tendencies toward what he describes as evil, and we also have tendencies toward the good. And so they're sort of both options for us. And so the challenge for us is nearly always trying to sort of fend off that temptation to evil and orient ourselves toward what he takes to be good. Now, the temptations, when Kant uses evil, he's using evil in kind of a technical sense. He doesn't mean like evil, like, I don't know, like satanic or, Voldemort or something. He means evil in just the sense of allowing your will to be directed by something that is not reason. So inclinations, like, and to have it as what he calls sort of a principle of your will. That's when something becomes evil. So, like, for instance, anybody can be having a bad day and get angry, which Kant would call an act, and like do something they shouldn't. So that for Kant wouldn't be evil. What is evil is when sort of a principle of, say, self-interest or selfishness becomes like sort of the principle on which you act. So a person who is sort of in the grip of evil is someone who allows their own interests or their own desires, their own inclinations to kind of like take root in their will in some sense and let those be the guiding force. So it's sort of like to make yourself like at the center of the universe in a sense for Kant. That would be evil for him. And he does think that there's a natural human tendency in many ways for us to do that. And it's a tendency that we're always fighting. And that fight is one that we're never fully going to win because we're human, he thinks. And so there is always that temptation, usually to put ourselves, our comfort, our interests, our desires ahead of everything else. And to make things more complicated, he thinks that we're also really good at deceiving ourselves about what we're doing. And so often when we're doing that, we don't even realize it because we're great at rationalizing what we're doing or giving excuses or all that kind of stuff. And so human nature, Kant thinks, it's not that we're sort of bad exactly, but that we're maybe corruptible if we're not careful. And so we have to work hard not to give in to these natural tendencies.
Right. Just a sort of side question. I mean, when we think about acting rationally, I mean, I don't necessarily want to get into a whole discussion on rationality and rational acting, but you might think that that's a kind of broad notion that might include like maybe we rationally do something that's evil, right? I mean, that's what if that's in our interest, if it turns out to be so. Is that sort of incoherent on Kant's approach, or what might he say about this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Kant is committed to the idea that evil actions are irrational. And that for many people is like, oh, they don't seem irrational, or at least they don't seem irrational in the sense that many people think. It's partly because there are lots of sort of evil characters in real life and in literature that seem to be very rational, taking the means to achieve their ends and doing it very well. And so Kant wouldn't say that evil is all irrational in the sense it's like a kind of madness or something. That's definitely not his view. It's a kind of warping of rationality. And it's a warping of rationality in a way that might be hard to see. So switching gears for a minute, Aristotle's conception of vice is basically a kind of, he kind of goes back and forth on this, that whether vice is all a form of ignorance. So Socrates and Plato appeared to be committed to this view. And Aristotle partly rejects it, but also not entirely. So for Aristotle, the vicious person, say the coward, is genuinely ignorant of what is worth doing in human life. Now, he thinks you're responsible for that ignorance, but you're really ignorant. The cowardly person just doesn't know what the courageous person knows about what is worth doing and what is worth sacrificing your life for. So on Kant's view, so that there's a kind of irrationality in that, they're lacking, they might be good at the means end reasoning, but they're lacking knowledge of a certain kind that is an achievement of rationality, the knowledge that's characteristic of this virtue of practical wisdom. So one of the big differences between Aristotle and Kant, I think one of the most important ones in my view, is that the knowledge for Kant of the categorical imperative, his primary ethical principle, is something that is available to any human being. It's a principle of rationality. It's accessible. Its truth is in some ways manifest to us through our rationality. And we often go to great pains to deny this and pretend that it isn't true. But there's a sense in which we are deluding ourselves, all of us, all the time, if we aren't acting in accordance with it. So there's a sense in which anyone who's failing to act in accordance with the categorical imperative on Kant's view is failing to act in accordance with a rationally necessary principle that they are rationally committed to accepting. So that's the sense in which, like, anyone acting wickedly is acting irrationally on Kant's view. And moreover, he thinks that so the person who is wicked, in some sense, always has, on Kant's view, the person who is acting badly always has access to the categorical imperative. So this is a big difference with Aristotle, because Aristotle thinks that the cowardly person really doesn't have the knowledge of the courageous person. And for Kant, the wicked person does. They know what the right thing to do is. They're just choosing not to do it. Now, that isn't to say, though, that knowledge is always present in the mind, because Kant does think that we are very often opaque to ourselves. We don't always know what our own motives are. This is where the rationalization part comes in. And so you could be someone who is engaged in a really morally bad course of action, but be justifying it to yourself and maybe to other people as being morally defensible. So you'll be wrong. It won't be morally good. You were wrong about it. And it was within your rational powers to have figured that out. But you might well delude yourself or deceive yourself into thinking what you're doing is actually just fine.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I mean, without getting more fundamentally about rationality. Yeah. I think that's good. And I did want to turn to the categorical imperative. It's one thing that Kant is very well known for. And although, as you note in the book, and take some time to explain, there isn't really just one version of this principle, although it's debated in the literature just how many there are and to what degree they're equivalent. Still, here you characterize three different formulations, and maybe we can just take those in turn. So there's the universal law formulation, which says to act only on that maxim by which you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. So could you sort of explain this principle?
Yeah, this is the one that people are very often most familiar with. It's the one that Kant does first in the groundwork. There's actually sort of two versions of this. There's a universal law and then a universal law of nature. The second one gets complicated in ways that we can just set aside. But this one is the idea that in the book, I talk about this. The three formulations that I discuss, I sort of attached equality, dignity, and community to. And so this is one that I think helps express Kant's idea that we are the equals of others. So the categorical imperative in this formulation, the universal law formulation, is a kind of test of what Kant called as a maxim. So a maxim of action is kind of like a plan of action. And crucially, it has to include your intention. And so the example I use in the book, and I use all the time in teaching, is about cutting in line. So Kant does not talk about cutting in line, but it really helps exemplify what he's talking about. And I have a feeling he'd be opposed to cutting in line. So not everybody, cutting in line is not a thing everywhere, because lining up is not a thing everywhere. But for places where lining up or queuing is a big deal, as it is in a lot of places, to cut the line, right? If your maxim is I'll just cut the line at, say, Starbucks because I really want to get my, triple latte sooner and I'm going to be late, right? And so I cut the line. So this explains I'm going to cut the line and it's because I want my triple latte or whatever it is now. So Kant says, in order to see if what we're doing is legitimate or permissible, then what we have to do is take that maxim and universalize it, by which we sort of imagine that everybody else has it as their maxim too. Now, the reason why Kant wants us to do this, I think, is because he's trying to show that permissible maxims are those that can be universalized. Impermissible ones are maxims that somehow show that we're making an exception for ourselves or wanting others to abide by principles that we aren't holding ourselves to. So the line cutting example, if we universalize that maxim and say that everybody will cut the line whenever they want to get their coffee faster than everybody else, it becomes obvious that that's not going to work because there won't be a line. It will just be like a mob at the front of it. The cutting in line is only effective in helping you achieve what you want if other people don't do it. So your success in acting depends on other people not doing what you're doing. So Kant thinks that this is the thing that generates the problem for it, because I am, in doing that, acting as though my ends matter more than the ends of other people just because they're mine.
And this, I think, I interpret Kant as saying, shows that I'm thinking of myself differently than I'm thinking of other people. I'm thinking of myself colloquially as a kind of the center of the moral universe, that rules are for the little people, not for me. So what this formulation of the categorical imperative does is it reveals a problem in the way that I'm thinking about myself in relationship to other people. And so if my maxim fails that test, Kant thinks, then it shows that I am thinking of myself in ways that can't be rationally sustained. Now, there's a lot of issues about this that have been discussed in the literature, because we can imagine maxims that actually seem fine but can't be universalized, or it looks like you could universalize maxims by making them super specific in ways so that other people wouldn't act on them. So there's a lot of questions about this as a technique. But I think that the underlying idea is one that's pretty intuitive, and the line cutting example shows that, right? Because we see that the person who's cutting in line just because they want their coffee fast is thinking of themselves differently than they're thinking about other people. They think of themselves as having a greater claim on their coffee or whatever than others. And that's the problem, I think, the moral problem for Kant, because it's just false. It's not true that my getting my coffee is more important than anybody else getting their coffee.
Yeah, that's helpful for sure. I mean, one other sort of concern that I've long had about these sorts of maxims is that, so sometimes we, maybe not because we separate ourselves or think that we have some right that others don't have or something like that. Sometimes we think that, look, it's just a matter of fact that most people are going to act in a certain way. And maybe it makes sense in those cases to, in part because most people are going to act in that way, maybe it makes sense for us to act in some other way to achieve some other end. Now, it wouldn't make sense if, most people would act like us in that situation. But given the fact that we expect most people, maybe you see what I'm saying. Like, is there some sort of sense to this response, or what do you think? Does it make sense?
It might depend on what's going on with what most people are doing. So there's some sense in which, and this kind of case is a problem for the universal law formulation if we take it to be the only way that we can sort of assess actions. If we think, well, so imagine like leaving early to beat traffic. So if I think, most people leave, so in my area, people leave very early to beat traffic. But if I say, well, most people leave their house at like 6:30. So I'm going to leave at 6 to beat traffic, counting on the fact that most people leave their house a little bit later. There doesn't seem to be anything morally wrong with that. It's hard to argue that it is. Like, I'm just counting on what I expect to be, or, most people go to the gym this time of day, so I'm going to go then when it's not busy. Those cases look totally unproblematic, where I'm just like counting on the fact that people achieving their own ends are doing this thing, and I can achieve my end better if I don't do it at the same time. That looks compatible. Like, everybody go to the gym or leave home at the time that suits them is a maxim that can be universalized. But still, because they have the same form, like I'm kind of counting on other people not doing the thing that I'm doing, but not in a way that looks to be problematic. Now, there's another version of that question, though, where I think, well, look, everybody else is doing this. Like, everybody else is, I don't know, using AI to write their papers or cheating on their income taxes or just like fill something in and be like, okay, well, everybody else is doing this, so I might as well do that too. That kind of reasoning Kant would want to cut off. He doesn't actually think the fact that other people are doing this bad thing gives you any justification for doing it yourself. So it would depend on the particular way in which your reasoning is operating in those cases and which features of other people's behavior you're counting on and whether it's compatible with you granting everybody a kind of equal moral status.
Yeah. So I guess maybe it would depend on the case, but yeah, I mean, it still feels to me like there should be some exceptions to this, but maybe, I don't know, maybe that's something that he would grant.
Yeah, I mean, some of it is, I think, like this in sort of variety of different theories that have more or less rootedness in Kant. Some of this comes out as like reasons you can justify to other people. So in the book, I also use as a contrast to the cutting in line for Starbucks case, like emergency room triage. Like I'm there for my, possibly, dislocated finger. At this point in the list, somebody else comes in, in cardiac arrest. They're going to jump to the front of the line, and that's right. That's as it should be, right? Because that's more of an emergency than what I have. So it's not as if the universal law formulation says that we all have to act in exactly the same way. The question is really, can I have this as my maxim in a way that's compatible with my acknowledging the full moral equality of other people? And so it might be, okay, like if my leaving at 6 a.m. to beat traffic works because other people don't leave till 6:30. But that's compatible with, okay, now all of a sudden everybody else starts leaving at 6 and now I have to leave at 5:30 or something to beat traffic like that. But it's compatible with my still acknowledging that everybody has the same standing or right to leave home at the time they want as me. And so it doesn't depend on other people not doing what I'm doing in quite the same way, in a way that shows a morally problematic attitude. So I think that's the thing that's going to distinguish the cases. And that's what the universal law formulation is trying to elicit. I think there aren't many Kantians who think that the universal law formulation is actually the way to, like, the ticket to understanding Kant's ethics. Most Kantian ethicists tend to be either humanity formulation, that's what I would say, or someone's kingdom events formulation. And Kant himself actually really doesn't use the universal law formulation that much. It's just kind of famous, but it distorts it a bit because the focus on it, I think, can make it feel like, well, it seems there's so many counterexamples. So like this can't possibly be right. But I think if we focus on the idea of it as trying to illuminate when and why we're doing something wrong by making an exception of ourselves or wanting other people to be bound by rules that we think don't have to bind us. And that's familiar. I think intuitively that's very familiar to most of us.
Right. Yeah, fair. Yeah, and so we should talk then about the second formulation, as you mentioned, the humanity formulation, which says that, yeah, we should act in such a way that we treat humanity, whether in your own person or in another person, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. Can you elaborate on this? And as I recall, Kant thinks that all of these different formulations are really of the same principle. So why might he think that this is getting at the same thing? It seems quite different.
That's a good question. There's lots of thoughts about why or how Kant might like trying to set it up. Like, is he trying to like add content at each time? Like, what is he doing with these principles? But the humanity formulation introduces something really, really important, which is a necessary end, and the end being humanity. And so that formulation has a structure to it. It's obviously really wordy, but there's multiple things going on that matter, that it focuses us on humanity as an objectively necessary end. On humanity here, I'm just going to use interchangeably with rationality. There's debate about that, but that's an objectively necessary end, and that it's necessary in myself and in others. So this is also really, really important because it establishes a crucial Kantian idea that we have to treat ourselves with the same kind of respect that we owe to other people. So self-respect is really, really central to Kant's theory. So there's the bit like, okay, the thing that has sort of the ultimate kind of value, we might say, is humanity. It's humanity in me and in others. And then it constrains our actions in two different ways. One way is that it puts a kind of block on certain ways of treating humanity in ourselves or others. And we can think of that as kind of a block on misusing people in a variety of ways, thwarting, incapacitating, distorting, or manipulating their rationality. And so these give rise to what are generally called perfect duties. So this, for Kant, in Kant's language, this is treating humanity as a negative end, an end sort of not to be interfered with in a variety of ways. So Kant's famous prohibition against lying falls into this category, because if you lie to someone, you are treating their rationality as something you can manipulate or work around, because you're deliberately giving them a false view of the world so that they will do what you want or not intervene with what you want to do. So you're deliberately distorting people's rationality. So there's that. And then the other part of it, Kant says, but that's not all there is to respecting humanity. We also have to respect humanity as an end. And this gives rise to what Kant starts the ends of as a positive end, or the imperfect duties. And there are two of these that come out in the Metaphysics of Morals: the end of promoting the happiness of others and our own perfection. So the humanity formulation gives us something to value, tells us that value is present in ourselves and others equally, and then gives us two different ways of sort of responding to that value, one in a negative, non-intervening sense, and one in a positive, sort of promoting or helping sense. So there's a lot going on in that principle, but that's also one of the things that makes it really, really useful as a practical principle. And in fact, the humanity formulation, or the language of it, is what tends to use more frequently in his other ethical writings. He rarely uses the language of the universal law formulation.
Right. Yeah, for sure. That's helpful. Yeah. I was thinking, like, if in one sense, isn't it right to say that the ultimate end of like moral action is to do the good, right? So in a way, when we are good to ourselves or good to others, isn't that sort of a means to that ultimate end, or is that the wrong way to think about it?
Yeah. So Kant, it's confusing, right? Because Kant, well, he talks about ends in multiple ways. So the phrase, like when we think about it, which is confusing. Like, what has value for Kant, the ultimate value is rationality, and rationality in us, which gives rise, and he talks about this in terms of us having dignity, not price. So having value that is incommensurable, and also having value that is absolute or unconditional as opposed to conditional. And so it's not conditioned, like my being valuable, you being valuable isn't conditional on anybody else's. So he's giving us a way to think about what value is and what has it. And the answer to that is rationality has it, and it has it in a way that means that it is absolute, it is unconditional, and there's dignity involved. And then that's supposed to be guiding everything else. So for Kant, the other kinds of goods that are out there, or the way we think about other things being good, have to be good in a way that's compatible with that value, some way, shape, or form. So this is why, like, trolley problems, there's so many of them, right? But on this, one of the standard trolley problems, the thought is that, and I think this is right, that, Kant would say that you can't push the guy onto the tracks to stop the trolley from hitting people further down the track. Not because it's not good to stop the train from running over those people down the track if we assume they're innocent, right? That would be a good thing to do. But it's a good that can't be achieved through the pushing the guy in the track. And that's because his value, the value of his rationality, which I would presumably be undermining, I would be compromising because he would be dead, right? In order to achieve that good. And so there's ways in which I think Kant gives us of thinking about not just like trade-offs between two sort of goods or values of the same kind, two rational beings, but also how other things could be achieved. So for Kant, like, wealth in the hands of an unscrupulous person is not a good thing. So to say that, oh, wealth is always good, and Kant's like, no, only if it's in the hands of someone with a good will, as he says at the beginning. So everything else is contingent on, or has to be compatible with, this one value. So it's not standard in Kantian ethics to talk about rational agency as a good, in part because it kind of suggests that we should be promoting it, like we should just be making more rational agents, and that's not the way that Kant thinks about it. But it is a kind of good, or a kind of value that is at the center of his theory.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And then we should move on to the third formulation, which is the kingdom of ends formulation, which is to act on the maxims of a universally law-giving member of a merely possible kingdom of ends. I mean, we should probably first clarify what a kingdom of ends is, and then what this formulation entails.
Yeah, the phrasing is kind of strange because it's a kingdom of ends with no king. That's quite important because everybody is equal in it. So the kingdom of ends formulation is probably most famous because it was the foundation of Rawls's political theory. So that basically is thinking of this in the kingdom of ends. But it's not the only place in which it's operative, because there's an ethical version of the kingdom of ends that shows up especially in the Kant's religion. But I had said before that I thought the universal law formulation was about equality, the humanity formulation is about dignity, and the kingdom of ends formulation is about community. It's common to think of Kant as just prescribing a kind of individual ethics, like ethics for me, ethics for you, but we're all just kind of like their traffic rules, like we're trying to sort of get around each other without hurting each other. But really, it's just a coordination problem. But that's not actually how Kant thinks about, I think, our relationship with others. So the kingdom of ends is where you think of yourself as part of a kind of like group of all equal sovereign lawmakers, in a sense, where you're coming up with laws. So there's lots to be said about what this would actually be like in practice, because it's very metaphorical in the groundwork, and then it's given more content, specific, certainly in Rawls, but elsewhere. But the idea is that when we are setting ends not just for ourselves, trying to sort of like maneuver around other people without wronging them, but we're often trying to set ends together. We're trying to achieve things together. And in doing that, we have to do it in ways that are compatible with everybody's equal standing in a community. So this is the rationale behind Rawls's veil of ignorance, right? In the original position, right? That he tries to set it up such that we're all equals. We don't know what particular features of us will be true of us in a society. And so we're trying to come up with law principles that will structure society in a way that treats each member of society as being as just as valuable as the other. And so Rawls thought the best way to do this was to abstract away from the particulars that introduce inequality. And so Kant is certainly concerned about this as well. But the fact that he introduces the kingdom of ends formulation does suggest that Kant thought not only about how we act as individuals, but how we act together. And so when we're making decisions and building societies with each other, that we do so in ways that is genuinely compatible with recognizing the kind of radical moral equality that he argued for already in the universal law formulation, and the sort of value of dignity and absolute value in the humanity formulation. What would it be like to live in a society in which we were all equally valuable, or as I say in the book, like no one is a special snowflake, but we're all special snowflakes in some sense. So like we're all equally special snowflakes. That's the kingdom of ends. What does it look like if we build a society like that?
Right. Yeah, and it's pretty sort of straightforward to see how this might lead into soon talk about like veils of ignorance and other principles like that. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I don't know if I had more to say. Ask about the imperatives generally, but perhaps you talk more about. Of course, Kant is well known as a deontologist, and a lot of his focus is on duties. Can you talk about his beyond what you've already said here? His general approach to duties, and you mentioned the notion of an imperfect duty, but what is the difference there between an imperfect and a perfect duty? Yeah, I don't know. Could you just talk a bit more about duties here from a Kantian perspective?
Yeah, so I should also have a caveat that I'm not a fan of the word deontology, especially as applied to Kant, only because I think it doesn't fully characterize what he's after. But having said that, I mean, it's clear that duties are really important. So perfect duties are generally duties. They're almost all duties not to do a specific thing. They could be a duty to do a thing. There is such a thing, but that would have to be like sort of, often it's like role specific type of duties, but generally speaking, it's aimed at a specific thing, a duty to do X or not to do X. That's what a perfect duty is. And so like a duty not to lie or a duty not to kill you would be a perfect duty. And you can fulfill all your perfect duties at the same time. Like you can just be not killing anyone right now. And so perfect duties have a kind of priority in Kant's system. Like there's no excuse for ever violating a perfect duty because they are all compatible with each other. Imperfect duties are standardly interpreted as duties to adopt a maxim or to adopt an end, often, like to take on a commitment. So for beneficence is an imperfect duty. And it's an imperfect duty because no particular act of beneficence could be absolutely required of me. Because for lots of reasons. One, I mean, we can't do all the beneficent actions that there are. It's not possible. But also it might be the case that in order to act beneficently, like say the people further down the trolley track, I have to violate a perfect duty. And Kant thinks I can't do that. So, but it doesn't mean that beneficent actions are just kind of like not really that important. Kant thinks they are duties, but the way to think about them as a duty is as a duty to adopt beneficence as your end, to make it your commitment, to make like other people's ends. It is partly their welfare, but for Kant, it's actually really important that it's their ends, not their welfare, because Kant isn't a believer in benefiting people in ways they don't want you to. Like, so So the end of beneficence is to take seriously the fact that other people have ends and projects of their own. And that has to be a commitment that structures my life. And so if I just go through life, like never attending to the fact that other people have needs that I might help them fulfill or projects I might help them do, then I'm failing in that duty of beneficence. So there's the perfect duties, which are binding on us at all times. And then the imperfect duties, which we might think of as kind of supplements, but really important supplements that structure the ways in which we go about our ordinary interactions. So there's always a duty, not, if I pass by someone in the street who needs help, I always have a duty not to like harm them in any way or manipulate them. And I also have this pressing imperfect duty very often to take seriously the fact that they need help and to help them if that's compatible with the other things that I'm doing.
Right. So would you say that we should always abide by or act on some imperfect duty so long as it's not contradicting some perfect duty, or is it weaker than that?
There's debate about this in the literature because Kant just doesn't say it's underdetermined. I mean, there's some versions that are like, no, David Comiskey defends a version of this. It's like, no, actually, if you're not fulfilling a perfect duty, then the imperfect duties are structuring the rest of your day, which would make it a very demanding theory, closer to something like we usually think of as utilitarianism. Most Kantians reject that view and hold something like a kind of a Comiskey says that like Tom Hill's view is a latitudinarian view, which is like something that's like, no, what it means is like, so there's a lot of debate among Kantians about what exactly the duty of beneficence requires of us and how demanding it is. And I think most people would probably agree with the idea, which I think is the right one, that it clearly just depends on what the need is and what it would take for you to have to fulfill it, how much you'd have to sacrifice. And intuitively, I think that's what a lot of people think. And Kant is pretty explicit. Like there's no way to sort of say in advance exactly what you're supposed to do. It will just require judgment, which isn't super helpful as a practical matter, but is intuitively quite right. And I think, or at least I think it is. And I think the way to think about it is beneficence means that the fact that somebody else has a permissible, not like evil ends, but a permissible need or a project or a goal or end always gives you a reason to help them, but it's a reason that could be overridden by other things.
Yeah. You mentioned that in particular cases it might require judgment. Is there not a worry that might make it a bit too subjective or, suspect to the individual's whims perhaps?
Yeah.
Or what do you think?
Yeah, it is. I mean, so there's, I think, two things. I think Kant does worry about that because, as we've already discussed, he thinks it's pretty easy for us to rationalize not doing what we should do. And so we have to be on guard for that. So there's sort of at least probably more than two, but two big tools that he has for this. One is what he calls the court of conscience, that he thinks that actually reflection will help us be like, you know what, I could have actually helped with that. I was just being lazy or selfish or something. So conscience, he thinks, can help us identify when we're not living up to what beneficence or other duties require of us. And then the other tool, which is one that perhaps people sometimes are surprised that would utilize, is cultivating certain kinds of affects or feelings like sympathy, which he thinks there's a duty to cultivate, and love. It's not just as an aid to doing our duty, but Kant thinks it's quite important that part of what we need is to actively cultivate sympathy for other people and their distresses. So Kant says in the Metaphysics of Morals that you need to actually go to sick rooms and debtors' prisons and poorhouses, and sort of see people's that like to sort of confront the fact that people need things and that because of that, you have reason to fulfill it. So he does think that we actually have to actively cultivate sympathy for other people and take an active interest in them and their needs. And we do that by cultivating affects. So he does think that there's some tools to make sure that we really are committed in the right way to other people as valuable members of our society. And so it's not hard to see how we often fail to do this all the time. Like, people get pushed off, like, okay, we're not really thinking about them or we're not really seeing them in some sense. Kant's like, no, the duty is actually to see them. And then when you see them properly, then it'll become evident that we need to, what is important in order to treat them in a fully respectful way.
Right. Yeah. And this reminds me, this stuff comes up a bit later when we talk about manners and stuff. But I guess we'll get to that. Yeah, and you mentioned the court of conscience, and that stuff comes up when discussing moral assessment. I thought that was an interesting sort of metaphor for thinking about how we might reflect and evaluate and try to defend and attack our moral decision making and such. I don't know if you wanted to add anything more about that, and maybe just if you want to talk more about how we might, or Kant suggests we go about assessing ourselves and others, morally speaking. I guess you've already been talking about that, but yeah.
Well, one thing that I think is kind of striking about Kant is that, at least he's not perfectly consistent about this, but when he's talking about conscience, he's pretty adamant that we should not be comparing ourselves to other people, that the standard that we're supposed to be using is the moral law. And there's lots of reasons. Some of this having to do with human psychology. Kant seems to think that if we compare ourselves with other people, it's just going to go badly, because either if we're choosing people, we'll choose people against whom we look good, like, okay, well, I kind of screwed up, but that person did it worse. Or if the comparisons are forced on us such that we fall short, that we'll end up just hating or resenting the other person. So he's really adamant that, like, comparing ourselves with other people is going to be unproductive, because our natural, like, feelings of competitiveness or desire to be superior or not inferior are just going to get in the way. And anyway, we don't need it, because we have the moral law, because Kant thinks that this is the place where that difference with Aristotle becomes apparent. Like, the cowardly person can't just reflect on their own behavior for Aristotle and figure out what's going wrong. And even actually looking at the virtuous person is only going to be so helpful if they're really cowardly. But for the most part, people will think, okay, well, you have like models or exemplars of how to behave. And Kant's like, not actual people. What you need is the moral law. How did my behavior, match up to what the law requires of me? Because Kant thinks I know that already. The categorical imperative is a principle of reason that everyone has access to. So it's a matter of reflecting on that and trying to do it honestly. And this is where the metaphor of the court, where you are the defendant, but also the prosecutor and the judge, which is kind of strange, but Kant thinks that's quite important. And he also thinks it's important that when conscience is operating properly, sort of two things will happen. Like, we will feel our own failings, right, in ways that Kant doesn't really talk about shame, but that sort of get us to see that where we've gone wrong. But he also thinks that reflecting on the moral law will also be inspiring in some sense, because we'll see what humans are capable of. So we'll sort of come out of reflections on conscience like, yes, okay, I really messed up, but I'm capable of more. Like, I can do better than this. So it's a very interesting account of conscience and how he thinks moral reflection ought to go. That if it ends up making us feel like we're hopeless idiots, it's gone wrong. But also it's gone wrong if we end up being like, well, it wasn't me, I'm perfect. It's something in between that we have to get to.
Right. Yeah, very good. And so we should talk a bit about the various vices that Kant deduces and you discuss in the book. So you have servility and arrogance, contempt, defamation, mockery, deceitfulness, and drunkenness. We definitely don't have time to get into much detail on these. Perhaps one that I wanted to ask about was deceitfulness, and as you mentioned already, Kant sort of famously has considers it a duty to be truthful or not to lie, and that's one of the perfect duties, right? Which there's been a lot of concerns about this. What really, like the famous case with the murder at the door or whatever. Can you? It's not even right to lie to save someone's life. I don't know. Can you talk about that? And how do you think? Do you think Kant would just bite the bullet on that? That it's still wrong in all those cases, no matter what you might be preventing. It's wrong to violate that duty.
To lie.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Kant's views on lying. So they come out, there's sort of three dimensions to it. So Kant thinks that familiarly, lying standardly violates a duty to the other person because you're treating them as a mere means. He also says it violates a duty to yourself, and it violates a duty to something kind of mysterious that he calls humanity as such, which I think we can kind of interpret as the moral community. So lying has a lot of layers to it. And there's also, for Kant, a lot of nuance to how he understands what counts as a lie. So in order for something to count as a lie, it has to be what Kant calls a declaration. And a declaration is a case where I am sort of saying something in a way that sort of gives it like a stamp of like, and what I am saying, I believe to be true. When I'm making a declaration, I'm putting something forward as though with a sort of like a seal of, and I'm thinking this is true. So Kant realizes that sometimes when we're talking, we're not doing that. We're not always saying like, I say, hey, how you doing? You say fine, right? Maybe you're not fine, but you're going to say fine because I'm not really expecting that to be true. It's just like something that we say. Or sometimes when someone's like, oh, how do I look? And you're like, great. Like the person just wants reassurance. They don't necessarily want a truthful answer to that question. And so we have conversations that are not really always about truth telling. But when they are about truth telling, where somebody is asking me a question and they really do want an answer and they have reason to expect that my answer is going to be truthful, Kant's like, then it has to be truthful. It doesn't mean that I have to answer every question, though. Like I could ask you, for some, like your bank account number, and you shouldn't tell me. You don't have to because I have no right to that information. So it's not that Kant thinks you have to answer every question, or that every time you answer a question, it has to be true, so long as there isn't an expectation that it's true and that you're not putting it forward as true. So it's already kind of a limited range of cases. But the infamous murder at the door case falls into one of those cases. There's several things about that situation that are weird. Like for whatever reason, you must give an answer. Like you have to answer the question that the would-be murderer asked you, which is already kind of weird. Like why would you have to answer them? Why can't you just punch them or something? But you do. And so Kant says, okay, well then in that case, the answer has to be truthful if you're purporting it to be truthful. And there's a lot, people have said a lot of things about this, like, well, why would anyone expect that it's truthful? And the murderers are trying to do something wrong. And interestingly, Kant says in that very essay, he's explicit, it's not actually the murderer that you're violating a duty toward, right? He's like, the murderer, you don't have a duty to the murderer to tell them the truth. The duty that you're violating by lying to the murderer, Kant thinks, is a duty to humanity as such. So this isn't necessarily super helpful because you might think, well, if you're the friend hiding in the house who's about to be killed, what do you care, right? Who the duty is owed to. But I think what it highlights is that there's another dimension to Kant's account of lying that sometimes gets overlooked if you think of it all in interpersonal terms, which is that Kant thinks it's in truth telling is absolutely foundational to having a society at all. This comes out more evidently in the lectures on ethics. But it's because truth is so important that we have to be able to rely on each other. He says in the lectures of ethics, like the only way we can increase our store of knowledge is either our direct experience or the testimony of others. And so when others are doing what philosophers call testify or testimony, giving testimony, like this is how I think the world is, it has to be true. But that seems to be a duty that thinks we owe to humanity as such. We do usually owe it to individual others. But interestingly, Kant thinks it's not a duty we actually owe to wrongdoers. Wrongdoers seem to have forfeited their right to the duty. But humanity has not forfeited its right to truth-telling. So with the actual murder at the door case, like in contemporary versions, when people are like, okay, let's imagine like it's Nazis at the door and you have, your Jewish neighbors are hiding in your attic. And you might be like, should I tell the truth? That kind of case, people are like, obviously you should lie. Like, and there you might think, I think the best way to go is like, what would actually the duty to humanity call from you there? Like, what's happened to truth telling in a society that has fallen that far from the norms of like decent behavior? And so I think there's a lot that could be said within Kant's own views about it. But having said all that, there is no question that takes truth telling more seriously than just about any other philosopher in the history of that too. But it's not quite as unintuitive, I think, as it seems.
Right. So yeah, just to be clear, Kant would not include like what we might call like lie by omission or lie by implication then, right?
Yeah, so he actually has a lot to say about like dissimulation and semblance. Like this is mostly in the lectures on ethics, but it's really quite complicated and interesting. But lies by omission would depend if I don't have a duty to report that. Like, so Kant says, absolutely, I do not have a duty to say everything on my mind, everything that I think is true. I do not have a duty to say those things. And so some of it will depend on whether the person actually really has the right to that information. But if it's possible he recognizes too to deceive people without saying a word. And
deceiving people deliberately to manipulate them in a way to get them to do what you want is still going to be a violation of respect for them, even if you haven't actually said anything false. And on the flip side, Kant is also opposed to white lies, because a white lie where you're like, oh, I'm just going to lie to this person because, it'll hurt their feelings if I tell them the truth. For Kant, those lies are lies, and they're wrong because they're basically patronizing, right? They're suggesting that I know better than you do what's good for you, or that you can't, in Jack Nicholson's words, you can't handle the truth. And so white lies are actually not, like they still are lies, and Kant takes those quite seriously. So it's very complicated on Kant's views on lying, because there's like the deception that is not actually lying. There are the things that are said that are false that aren't lies. And then there are the false statements that are lies, but that we shouldn't tell them because we're violating a duty to humanity as such. It's very nuanced.
Yeah.
I think that's a good way, though, because honestly, lying is really complicated. And so I think it's good that Kant's view is complicated, and more complicated than most people realize that it is.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, just as a sort of general concern, though, like not about lying per se, but about, talking about these sort of perfect duties and like inviolable rules. Like, I don't know, I feel like it seems reasonable that these should be general rules for ourselves and to others and to society and so on. But it maybe seems a bit too strong. I think a lot of people would think that these are, they're super strict, and there shouldn't be any, you should never violate them. I don't know. What do you think about the view that they shouldn't be as strict as Kant thinks?
Well, I think it would depend on the case. So, I mean, the sort of the super strict rule that I think Kant would stand by is that it's always wrong to treat someone as a mere means. And so there's no course of action that can be morally justifiable if it involves treating anyone, yourself or someone else, as a mere means. And then the question is, when is that actually happening? So back to trolleys, because people are familiar with them, right? So I think a Kantian's going to have to say, you can't push the unwilling guy off the bridge onto the tracks. That you cannot do, because then you are using him as a mere means to stop the trolley, even if it's for a good cause. But you might ask him to volunteer, or you might ask him to, like there's ways of thinking about ways in which we can either make sacrifices ourselves or ask people to develop policies. So Tom Hill's written about this in the context of responding to terrorists. Can you, if terrorists have hijacked a plane and are flying it toward, the U.S. Capitol, could you shoot them down knowing that you'll also kill lots of innocent people? And answer that, I think Hill argues, this seems right. Like maybe, like it depends on whether we could have policies such that, in back to the kingdoms of ends formulation, that we know that might put people at risk, but put people at risk in a way that's compatible with respecting them. So just think like rules for thinking that ambulances or fire trucks can go through stoplights, right? Or police chases, or things that put other people at risk. We think there might be a way of doing that, as long as the risk is borne equally, which of course it very often is not. But if it's actually borne in a way that's compatible with respect for people, there might be things that could be done that actually aren't treating people as mere means, because it is compatible with respecting them. So I think a lot depends, much as hanging on when it is that we're actually treating people as a mere means and when we're not. But when we are, Kant's going to hold the line, bite the bullet, and be like, it is always wrong, no exceptions.
Right. Yeah. I mean, even with the trolley case, like, I mean, you could imagine, okay, in the given case, you're killing the one person, and that's using them as a means to further end. But I mean, you could imagine using them as a means in some less destructive way. Like maybe you just ended up, like, I don't know, not harming them significantly, but still using them as a means to save a group of other people, like 5 people or whatever. Like, even if people found it maybe it's sort of intuitive in the initial case, yeah, okay, maybe we should use this person as a means to that end. It seems to strain credulity, I think, in these further cases where the cost of the other person is quite low. And maybe this is more, I don't know, kind of utilitarian way to think about it. But nevertheless, the result seems sort of plausible to me, and I think to most people, that like if you just cause them some minor inconvenience, but got some great benefit to some other people or to society or whatever, even if that involved using the person as a means, maybe that's the right thing to do, especially if there's no other option. So I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you think?
So some things that we think like normally would be justified probably don't count as treating someone as a mere means. So let's suppose that like I need to take your car to go save people's lives briefly, right? And I'll bring it back, right? So that would be a case where like I'm doing something that normally I would need permission to do, but I don't have time, you're not around or something like this. I just have to take it. But we would expect me to apologize later. We also should expect that you should have agreed to my taking your car to do this. So for Kant, like that wouldn't be treating you as a mere means, even though I haven't asked permission, because it's compatible with it. But we imagine like something where I really do have to disrupt your rationality in order to achieve some other end, some evil scenario where I have to give you some kind of pill to disrupt your rationality so that you will do something, or I don't know, that you'll forget something. Yeah, like a memory spell or something like this too, so where I'm impeding your rationality to achieve some great end. I think Kant is going to have a lot of qualms about it, even if we're like, well, it's not going to hurt you very much. The question of whether it will hurt you is not really the main consideration. Now, we might think that, because ordinarily we would think like, okay, you and I are in some weird science fiction situation where the only way I can save a bunch of lives is to give you some kind of pill that will impede your rationality for 15 minutes. We would normally think that if we had time, I would be like, hey, do you mind, Troy? Do you mind taking this pill for 15 minutes? We can save a bunch of lives that way. And you'd be like, sure, no problem. Happy to do that. In that case, that would be fine. But let's suppose that for whatever reason, I can't ask you that I have something that is blocking me from doing that. I think those cases are difficult because sometimes we're like, well, if I could tell you, you'd agree to this, but maybe you wouldn't. Like, I don't know. Like, I'm kind of assuming a lot there. But sometimes we can also see how this goes wrong in personal relations. Someone's like, oh, they won't mind, but actually they do mind, right? And so someone's like, oh, they won't mind. So the fact that you would have sort of the authority to be like, however selfish you are, refusing, or I shouldn't make you selfish. I should have made myself the selfish one, but that wouldn't be irrelevant. It's like in the real life case of like adults, like with donating a kidney, like as a living kidney donor. Standard rules of medical ethics be like, you cannot compel someone to donate a kidney. And you can't even compel someone to donate a fingernail. Like, not that that's helpful, but like, you just can't. And you might be like, wow, a person who wouldn't, or just make it like a pint of blood, like a person who wouldn't donate a pint of blood to save someone's life. That seems really selfish. And yet we might think, people have a right to be selfish that way. You can't go in and like take their pint of blood from them, even if they're just a horrible person for not doing that. I think Kant would draw the line there and be like, that's right, they're a terrible person, but you cannot like hold them down and take the pint of blood to save this other person. But man, can you tell them they're a terrible person for refusing?
Yeah. I still feel like there's going to be a lot of unintuitive cases here, but anyway.
Yeah. I think Kantians have to bite the bullet on at least some of these cases. I think there are fewer such cases than it might seem, that Kantianism actually has more space for this than it might seem on the surface, and that there are ways around it. But there's going to be some cases where the utilitarian is going to be like, we should do this. And the Kantian is going to be like, no, you cannot.
Yeah, fair.
And then sometimes the Kantian intuition is probably going to be more appealing than the utilitarian. And sometimes the utilitarian one will be more appealing.
Yeah. So another thing that's sort of come up already, but is important in the book here is like personal development and how we can grow morally and just generally, according to Kant. I don't know. Could you talk sort of briefly about how Kant thinks about that?
Yeah. So earlier you had mentioned vice, and one of the things that I think is very interesting, especially about the doctrine of virtue, is how much of it is actually framed in terms of vices, not duties. Kant is way more concerned about vice than it seems. And that's because he thinks basically that it's a big threat. And so we have to spend a lot of time thinking about how to fend off vice. And so some of personal moral development is going to be about sort of figuring out how not to like succumb to selfishness, laziness, what have you, all of the racism, all those things, like himself was a racist, but all those things that we shouldn't succumb to. There's going to be that as part of it. But beyond that, Kant also thinks we have a duty to promote our own, he calls it moral and natural perfection that comes out of self-respect. So there's a sense in which Kant thinks there's a kind of duty to yourself to
I mean, to say like sort of to make something of yourself is a little bit strong, but to do things like to go out in the world and to sort of, use your talents well in the world, and not to spend your whole life binge watching Netflix, but to actually use your capacities in ways that benefit not just you, but the world more generally. So Kant thinks this is a duty that we owe sort of to the humanity, but also a duty that we owe to ourselves. It's a matter of self-respect to be able to do this, which is interesting. I mean, Kant has more resources to talk about self-respect than most theories do. It's a very robust account and it's very central to it. So it is and interesting, like for Kant, like there's a strong moral reason, arguably a duty, to seek out friends, to have friends. Like that is a duty because friendship is a really important moral relationship. And so there are self-respecting reasons, Kant thinks, to sort of push us out into the world and to use our capacities and to engage those capacities well, to learn things, to educate ourselves, to participate in the lives of a community, which it doesn't get as much focus as like the duty, the objection to lying does, but is a really important part of Kant's ethics, because Kant thinks that part of our task as moral beings is to help further the progress of humanity. And we do that by contributing positively to it insofar as we can. So if you're, a brilliant mathematician, you should be doing math. If you're capable of, doing other kinds of tasks, like for the sake of humanity, then you should do those things.
Right. Yeah, you might even think that this, I'm not sure if he says this, but you might think that these sorts of imperatives kind of fall out of the categorical imperative, or at least some forms of them, especially, well, in the sense that we think that, well, it would be sort of absurd if everyone, didn't work to, like if everyone just sort of stayed in their own bubble and didn't realize their talents and work towards improving society, then, well, society would fall apart maybe. Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's also like duties to kind of like take care of your health in some ways for Kant too, like to sort of like not diminish your rationality. He's clearly pretty horrified by opioid use, which was common in his day, but he worries a lot about that. I think there's actually arguably a Kantian duty to drink caffeine if it improves your rational performance. But yeah, so the development actually have like in terms of like body and mind and all of that to sort of in some sense make ourselves fit to serve, not just serve in the way, but also to sort of be sort of a member, like a membership in the human community, to sort of like be a good participant in the task of creating communities and participating in the kingdom of ends. And it can take a lot of different forms, but it is clear that Kant thinks this falls certainly out of self-respect, and also it seems out of the duty to humanity as such.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, so then just two questions and to wrap up. First, I did want to just talk briefly about manners, and it comes up later in the book, and how, according to Kant, practicing, it recommends practicing certain good habits, even if not maybe initially sincerely, because that might make us more likely to develop actual attitudes. Good attitudes like respect, love, courtesy, hospitality, gentleness, and so on. Is that how you put it? Is that yeah? Is that
yeah?
Maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, briefly. I think he thinks it has two roles. I think he does have it as an instrumental role, that by sort of treating people in a certain way, then we'll come to have the feelings. He does the same thing with love, like do acts of beneficence and you'll come to love people. So if you do the outer, then the inner will follow to some extent. He also seems to attach a kind of aesthetic value to making virtue pleasing. So he says there's a duty to cultivate the social graces. And that is because, he also thinks there's a duty to sort of be cheerful in doing the duty. You don't want to make, morality look like a terrible thing. It should be, it adds a kind of, not just aesthetic, it's sort of like a moral aesthetic. It's a complicated thing. But by making virtue appealing, you're encouraging others to do it and making it something that it seems aspirational in interesting ways. So there's this instrumental part of it. It will just make you develop these. But there's also the manners as a way of relating to each other, that he calls this a beautiful illusion of virtue, that he thinks has a kind of value to it, insofar as it helps remind us about what is good about morality.
Right. Fair. Definitely could be explored more, but I do normally end these interviews with a kind of general meta-philosophical question about the value of philosophy. Maybe it's worth tying that in specifically to Kant and his moral philosophy here. Like, what do you think is the? I mean, you could speak to the value of philosophy in general if you want to, although that's a big question. But maybe more specifically, what do you think is the value of, well, understanding and engaging with, and maybe taking to heart some of Kant's writing here?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think philosophy in general is just fun, and that's a sufficient reason to do it. But even apart from its being fun, it's also, I think, a way of like sort of systematizing things that are already present in our minds. I mean, this is like philosophy does more than just systematize. Obviously, it opens up new avenues of exploration. But often I'm teaching ethics, like, look, these are like, you're already thinking about ethical questions, right? The question is then like, but they're hard, right? And what philosophy does in ethics is help us think through those. Like, what is significant here? How should we think about this? And it does this in part by pointing out things that are relevant that we didn't realize that were relevant, giving us ways to think about them. And some of those ways are frameworks that we can use to at least get a grip on what's going on. So I see Kantian ethics as an extremely powerful ethical framework for getting a grip on normative and applied questions. It is not perfect. Clearly, Kant gets some stuff wrong on a lot of things too, but it is powerful because it gives us a starting place. So even concepts like respect and dignity. So I often, like one topic I talk about a lot when I teach is ghosting people, which students always find very interesting. Like, is it wrong to ghost or not? The answer seems to be like, it depends, right? But it's natural to talk about those in terms of like respect and what we owe each other in terms of like kind of consideration and acknowledgement. Like, and here is a framework at which those concepts are already at home. And so it gives you a way of thinking about what's at stake, what might be wrong with ghosting, or what might be okay about it, like what's really going on. And I think for that, as a way of sort of giving us things to grasp as we engage in our own explorations about it, like kind of like footholds or, things that we can hold on to as we do our own thinking, that it's very, very valuable for that it gives us, kind of like starting points or outlines for engaging in our own philosophical explorations. And I think Kant is very good at doing that, at least for a lot of the ethical questions that most interest me, particularly about interpersonal relationships. It's a very powerful theory for that.
Awesome. Yeah, fair enough. I guess I'll draw the questions to a close there. But thanks so much for being here, Professor Stohr.
And thanks for having me. This was fun.